You took the plunge and now you're doing bass lessons. But how long should a lesson be? 15 minutes, 2 hours, something in between? Well, we asked and the community answered. What's going on? It's Jason Heath, and if you dig content like this, consider signing up for our email newsletter. It comes out every Tuesday and Friday, and it's a quick hit of what's happening in the bass world, education, entertainment, all that good stuff. Link in the description below. And like most of the good ideas in this channel, this video was inspired by a community post. Rachel Hawkins in our DBHQ community group, we got that linked up in the description below. She asked, how long are your double bass lessons? Easy question, but complicated answer actually, and if you want to read the complete thread, check that out. Very nuanced. I did attempt to take and break down some of the numbers and the data and some of the commonalities, but I've also taught quite a few lessons over the years, and it's a multifactorial answer that how long a bass lesson should be question, in my opinion. To me, there are 6 factors that go into determining a bass lesson, and we're going to break each of those factors down in this video. To me, the first factor is age. Are you 7 years old? Are you 70 years old? Are you somewhere in between? And by and large, I give shorter lessons to younger students. They generally have shorter attention spans, and that just seems to work better in my experience. There are many other contributing factors, or if you're going to a teacher's house for a private lesson, so again, lots of factors, but age is one of the key things. I will recommend typically that a 16, 17-year-old student gets, say, an hour lesson, or if they're in a school setting, maybe a 50-minute lesson because they have a break between periods. If they are a middle school student or elementary school student, I'll often recommend a half-hour lesson, or sometimes even shorter. But one of the big factors, and people talked about this over and over again in this thread, is there's a certain amount of setup and teardown time inherent in any private lesson, but especially with double bass. You gotta get it out of the case, you gotta get the bow out, you gotta get the end pen out, you got to get the stool set up, and all of that just takes a certain amount of time that maybe a flute lesson or a violin lesson won't have that same burden. Of course, everybody has to set up, but there's just a little bit more with bass, getting it out of the car, and so I do think some time is obviously lost to all of those activities. Now, that still can be done in a 30-minute lesson, and that might be the right amount for somebody who's new to bass, just trying to hit one topic. Generally, 45 minutes I found to be a really good amount, just because there is the time for the packing and the unpacking, the how are you doing this week, that sort of personal relationship that I've always loved to have with my students, and I'm sure vice versa for students with their teachers. An hour lesson I think is great for high school students, and then if somebody is an adult and coming to me, the middle-aged person or just an adult enthusiastic to learn, I try to give them as much time as I can. So I have gone 2 hours, even a little over 2 hours, though I start to lose focus after 2 hours. So again, if you're 7 years old, or you're trying to win a job in a professional orchestra, or you are just thirsty for knowledge and you're an adult learner, I think that age factor will determine to quite a big extent how long that lesson should be. Next up is ability level, and by and large, I will not give as long a lesson to somebody who is new to the bass. I try to get one concept dialed in and really work on that. If somebody is auditioning for their all-state orchestra and they're working and they're just on the cusp, we're going to take a little bit more time. And so ability level does factor in, though I have given hour and a half or longer lessons to people that are brand new to the bass, and I've given really more condensed lessons to people who just don't have time in their schedule. I do find that with somebody who's really serious about advancing on the bass, 45 minutes, especially by the time you get to middle school, that's kind of like the least amount of time I want to have with somebody. But again, ability level will have some impact. Then frankly, there's interest level. Is somebody just thirsty? That's the word I've been using these days for knowledge, just hungry, just wanting to soak up every bit of info, or is this one of many activities that maybe their parents are having them do? That's going to have an impact. Am I practicing with the student for a lesson, or are they actually working on their own between lessons? I get a little tired of students who only touch the bass at their actual lesson. Those students usually fade out and don't come back. And as I got older and more experienced, I kind of moved those students out of my teaching studio. But if somebody's just really not touching the bass and it's just one of those things that their mom or dad are having them do, half-hour lesson might be great just to get the instrument in their hand, do a little something. And I have found that interest level can vary greatly over the years. I've had people that I never write anybody off, but I kind of wrote off as not being that serious a student. And then all of a sudden they got that spark and the interest level came into the picture. And all of a sudden the lessons became, certainly for me, a lot more fun, probably for them too. I've also, depressingly, had the other thing happen. Someone who was really hungry on the bass and then life just got in the way and other interests. And that's cool, but their time on the bass, their hunger and thirst for knowledge just kind of diminished or got scattered. And so those students, hey, maybe an hour would have been great, but now they're just kind of checking in, and maybe a half hour, 45 minutes is more than enough. Then there's environment, and this is just a logistics thing a lot of the time, especially if you're in school. Many schools, and I'm referring to kindergarten through 12th grade, kind of elementary, middle school, high school here in the States, many schools bring in private teachers and have them pull out students and give them lessons during orchestra class or during their study hall. It can be a real win-win model because the teacher can teach during the day. They don't wait till after school to teach the student. The student doesn't have to go drive 20, 30, 45 minutes after school, yet another after school activity. So it can really work out great for someone who wants lessons and for a teacher who's looking to fill out their schedule and work with some motivated students. But logistically, schools have bells and periods, and while you might want to give somebody an hour-long lesson, you might only have 25 minutes with them. Now, in a school setting, oftentimes their instruments are already unpacked, they're ready to go, so even though you only have 25 minutes, you can really maximize those 25 minutes. And I've also found that students in one of these school settings are so used to their life. This is maybe a broader conversation. It could be a little depressing if you think about it, but they're so used to allotting attention span of 25 minutes for these half periods or 50 minutes for these full periods that they're used to being efficient with that interval of time. So even though 25 minutes might not seem like a lot, and it probably isn't a lot for somebody who's 16, 17, 18, you can still get a lot done. And if you can get that student for an entire period, 50 minutes in many cases, that's even better. So maybe not quite as much time, but because of the environment, there are many advantages. And so sometimes 20, 25 minute, 45, 50 minute lessons, that can actually be amazing. On the other side of the coin, if the environment is your home studio and someone comes over on a Saturday and there's time to stretch out, an hour lesson would be great, or even an hour and then scheduling the next student like a half hour after the end of that other student. That lets you go an hour with some conversation. I've always found that to be a great way to do lessons. It does eat up a little bit more of your day, but it keeps you from that clock watching kind of thing that can happen with our students, especially when it's at your home studio and you have to get them in and out of the front door. Some people have a room where students can unpack. All depends on your teaching setup. But I've found a lot of success having an hour-long lesson and then either a half hour or maybe even just a 15-minute gap just to give a little bit of time to wrap up and pack up the bass and not feel like you're shooing people in and out. Another factor is frequency. I would rather teach a student for 25 minutes every single week than for an hour every other week or 2 hours once a month. So frequency. Doing it as often as possible with as much regularity as possible, and that's true for private lessons. I find that to be really helpful. Or maybe you're in some amazing setting where you get 2 private lessons a week. It's rare, but it could happen. Well, that's even better. On the other hand, if I'm working with an adult student that wants to come and just kind of check in with me every 2 months, 6 months, something like that, I actually really enjoy those lessons, and they're a little bit more philosophical, long-range planning, talking about practicing, and I find with students like that, an hour and a half lesson is kind of the minimum, a 2-hour lesson, or what I tell them is come over and we'll go until we can't stand it anymore. And that's generally 2 hours, maybe 2 hours and 15 minutes even, something like that. But for someone who's in a K-12 program or a college student, although college students can vary, sometimes those long lessons can be perfect for college students. I find that just having a regular frequency and maybe not quite as long is optimal. And finally, I like to remind myself that that private lesson is one in a chain of factors guiding that student's education broadly, but also musical education. And I think back to my programs in Chicago that I worked with, the Midwest Young Artists Program or Chicago Youth Symphony, or we have similar programs here in the Bay Area. A lot of the time the students would get a music theory class, they would have a chamber music coaching, they'd have an orchestra rehearsal, they'd have maybe a bass master class, and then they'd have a private lesson too. So the lesson is like part of the learning. I think back to my own time in college, I would have my lesson once a week, but I'd also have studio class, and I would have orchestra 3 times a week, and I'd have my classes. And so you're getting this whole musical education oftentimes, and the lesson is part of that. And if you understand that, you can actually make the lesson work in context with what else is happening in that student's life. And even if it's not in a youth orchestra program like I'm describing, Chicago Youth Symphony or other programs like that, there's a rhythm to students, particularly in some sort of school system. So maybe they're getting ready for their regional all-state audition, or their audition for colleges, or their audition for the youth orchestra, and just kind of understanding and kind of long-term planning how those lessons fit into the broader picture and the broader goals. I think that all has an impact. And I like to think that I can communicate with someone in a 15-minute interval. I know people who teach younger students, those really short lessons are all you need or all you want. I'm talking to people who teach 3, 4-year-olds, maybe even 5-year-olds. Short, get them in, get them out, get the repetition. That can be great. If we're talking about somebody who's a middle-aged person who's just spending their time obsessed about the bass, that's a very different context. And just being able to flip that switch and really tailor your teaching to the individual student, I find so important. If you want to learn more about that, check out what we've got linked up. We'll see you there.